Hello people of YouTube. In today's video I'm going to be making a wooden tri-square, or one of those kind of T-shaped squares. Now I'm going to be making this out of a piece of oak, 1x2, and a piece of walnut, also 1x2. For the piece of walnut, you're going to want 3/8 of an inch off, so basically you can just take your marking gauge and mark that right in half, and it's going to be 12 inches long or 1 foot long, so I have that marked out right here, which I'm probably going to use my plane to just cut down to that line. For the piece of walnut, I'm going to leave it to the full thickness of 3/4 of an inch, and I'm just going to cut it at 6 inches, and that is going to make a nice looking joint right there, cut off right there. Now, I think this is going to look pretty cool and also hopefully function well, but can't function unless there's a joint connecting them. With this, I'm going to be using a sort of a half-lap bridle joint, where on this piece, these 3/8 of an inch are going to fit into here. So basically, I'm going to cut 3/8 of an inch into this piece of wood, then chisel out the waist. Then once I have this planed down to where it needs to be, that will be able to just kind of go on top of there, and it should fit pretty well. In cutting this, I think that the best choice would be to use these two bench hooks and this miter saw, and with those two tools, just very slowly take out this line and cut it to the size that I want. Now, I'm using this thin saw and these bench hooks because I think that my larger saw over there would be a little bit too large and too aggressive for something this small. Now that you have cut the main part of your walnut, it's time to move on to dimensioning your piece of oak. For this piece of wood, what I'll be starting off with is taking my number 4 hand plane, preferably a scrub plane, and with a very light setting, just take off that little chunk of excess inside of my vise. Next, after I have that part done, I'm going to move to my number 5 hand plane and plane off this excess piece of the top area. Then I'm going to switch to my smoothing plane to finish that off. Something that I like to do when I'm planing is come and take off this little edge right here before I start to cross plane. Most of the time what this does is prevents these last couple of fibers in the wood from peeling out. I like to do this kind of backwards, and it really doesn't matter how you do it. You just kind of pull it, and then that just takes it off, rounds off the edge, and these fibers are much less likely to tear out. Now that you've shaved off the top of this board to the size that you'd like, you should just take it out of your vise, and it should look something like this. Now, it's okay if you get a little bit of tear out like I did right here, because you can just put that on the piece of wood that you're going to be scrapping anyway. Now, what you gotta do is line this up with your shooting, or not your shooting, but your planing stop. You gotta take your number 5 jack plane. Now, with this plane, you're just gonna be riding across the top, and you gotta shave that down until you've got the piece that you want, which is a piece that's only this big. Now, one technique that'll make this a lot easier is, instead of just starting going straight, you want to bevel these sides and get a little angle going all the way down to your line. And then you just ride off the top, which will make it go way faster. Once you have planed the face and back of your piece of wood to the size that you need, it's a good idea to use your number 5 plane to just clean up those edges and make sure that they're nice and flat so that you can get an actual square reading when it comes time to actually put this onto the square. Once you have cleaned up your arm of your tri-square, you now have to prepare your two pieces of wood to join together. Now, how I like to do this is line up each piece of wood with just a little sliver of wood open on either side, then right along that line, go in with a chisel and hammer it in. And then once you have the chisel line in there, you gotta take a knife and cut down to the end of that chisel so that you have a little bit of a trench in there so that your saw can just ride in and start to cut. Now, you want to cut with the saw just a little bit less than 3/8 of an inch so that your arm doesn't get overcut and isn't too deep in. You want it to be flush. Once you have cut the area for your arm to go into on the top of your tri-square, it should look something like this. Now, it's okay for it to be coming out the top a little bit because that's what we want. Now that it's coming up a little bit over and it's mostly a tight fit, the next part that you have to do is start to actually join the two pieces together. In my experience, the best way to do this is to take a little bit of wood glue, apply it to both sides, and then drill one hole through the top down to the bottom piece. Then you can place a dowel in there, and while the glue is still wet, you can adjust it until it's still square. Once it's square, you can drill another hole, put in another dowel, and then drill a third hole and a third dowel. I believe that this is the best way to figure it out and make sure that it's square. In order to assure that it's square, you first have to put a piece of paper, or you could even just use your workbench, and line up your square to the workbench. Then you will trace out the arm, flip the square around, and trace it out again. If the two lines are exactly on top of each other, then your square is actually square. But if they kind of go away from each other and make an angle, then it is not square. You want to keep adjusting how angled your arm is compared to the top until you have a perfectly square reading. So I just put in the second dowel pin, and this square is now perfectly square. So something that I like to do is, while it dries, put in 2 of these really strong clamps to make sure that it does not move around at all. Now, all you gotta do is wait about 6 hours, and then you can continue working on the project. Once your glue is dried, you're basically on the home stretch. Your square already functions as a square, and everything else is basically just for looks. First thing I'm gonna do is flush cut off these ends of the dowels on both sides. Then I'm gonna cut off this excess of each wood off of each part that I left proud. After that, I'm probably gonna sand it off a little bit just to make it more smooth. And then I'm gonna soak it in some linseed oil. This will give it a nice shiny surface and make it look a lot more professional. For making these flush cuts, I prefer to use my Ryoba saw as more of a flush cut saw. The easiest way to do this is to use your lighter rip cut teeth, as they don't need as much pressure as the larger, more aggressive crosscut teeth. Once you have finished the flush cuts on your square, it should look something like this. Now, most of the corners here are going to be a little rough and just kind of uninviting. Also, you might be finding some rough or dirty spots on your piece. Now, an easy way to solve this is through sanding. Sanding can make everything more flush and seem more smooth. I like to start out with a 40 grit, which seems pretty low of a grit for most people, but I find that it can really get rid of many bad things. Then I changed to a 150 grit, which can start to smooth things out. Then I changed to a 220, which starts to get rid of all the scratches. And then I finish with a 320, which gets rid of the last scratches and leaves a nice smooth surface. Once you have finished sanding the entire square and chamfering off the edges with a file, it's time to move on to staining it. Now, this is very optional since this is going to be a workshop piece, but I like to make my projects look a little bit better. With the specific stain that I'm using, boiled linseed oil by Clean Strip, you have to first rub on the stain into the wood, then you have to let it dry for a couple minutes so that it can soak in. After those couple minutes are done, you have to then use a dry rag to wipe off all the excess and then let it dry for a few more hours. Now, when you're applying stains like this, it's very important to wear protection on your hands because some of these things can be very kind of like chemically, and they can penetrate into your hands, so it's safer to wear protection. Now that you've waited the 10 minutes and rubbed off all of the stain, it's practically done. The stain's already dried in, and you can see that it turned out really nice. Now, this was way easier than I thought it was, and it turned out way better than I could have ever thought it would. Now, this is just beautiful, and if I can make something like this that's still so functional, I think that whoever's watching this now can make it too. Without further ado, here's some shots of this just by itself. Now, as you can see, this tri-square just turned out wonderfully, and if there's any tool that I've built by myself in the shop and would like to build again, I think this just has to be the one. I really like how it came out, and it's just so clean. I'm definitely gonna make this again someday.